In 1974, the owner of this house murdered his whole family. He said voices told him to do it.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In this episode, we're going to look at the parallels between the Amityville horror and Chris Watts. You may or may not be aware that Ronald DeFeo Jr., the killer who inspired the movie The Amityville Horror, you've just heard a clip from that in the beginning, he has just died, according to a spokesman from the New York State Department of Corrections and Community Services. DeFeo was 69 at the time of his death. He was convicted of killing his parents, both of his brothers and both sisters. So ultimately 6 people inside their home in Amityville in 1974. He was serving a 25-year sentence to life when he died on March the 12th, about 4 days ago, at the Albany Medical Center. We don't know what the cause of death was. I wouldn't be surprised if it does have something to do with the coronavirus. There have been quite a few criminals that have died of the coronavirus, including Peter Sutcliffe, aka the Ripper. We're going to briefly go over the Ronald DeFeo case, the story that inspired the Amityville horror movies and books, quite a lot of books besides those. And we're going to look at how or if there are any parallels between all of that and the Chris Watts case. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So I'm just going through a generic description here from Wikipedia, and basically DeFeo was born in 1951 in September. He is regarded as an American mass murderer. So mass murder is basically when 4 or more people are murdered virtually simultaneously. That is regarded as mass murder. Chris Watts narrowly misses that definition because his unborn child was 15 weeks old, and if his child had been born and he'd committed the murder then he would have qualified as a mass murderer. I'm just saying he comes perilously close to being thrown into that horrible label. I'm not saying that Chris Watts doesn't deserve it, but technically he misses it by just a couple of weeks. So just broadly, the main differences between the Watts case, military helicopters just passed by overhead. I wonder what's going on. But the main difference between the Watts case and the murders of DeFeo are that DeFeo used a .35 Marlin rifle, right? And so you can imagine a lot of injuries, a pretty grotesque scene in the DeFeo case, which is totally different. It's a totally different scenario than in the Watts case, in the sense of the injuries, the type of injuries, and the type of murder weapon. Okay. Now we're going to go through the scenario of DeFeo, and I want you to keep your mind open and think about where there are certain similarities or parallels to the Watts case. I'm obviously going to highlight them, but I want you to, as we go through the narrative, just keep your eyes and ears peeled for what stands out. So at about 6:30 p.m. on a Wednesday in November in 1974, and this is about a year before the Ripper got his start in the UK across the Atlantic, 23-year-old DeFeo, so 10 years younger than Chris Watts, entered Henry's Bar in Amityville, Long Island, New York, and declared, "You gotta help me. I think my mother and father are shot," right? So that is basically his sermon on the porch. That is basically his declaration. He's asking for help. Bear in mind, this is quite a long time ago, right? It is, almost 50 years ago. So you didn't really have television and the internet and reporters to the extent that you do now. And so he runs to a bar and tells them what has happened. So him and a small group of people go to 112 Ocean Avenue, which was situated not far from the bar. And what they found inside with this group of folks from the inside of the bar was DeFeo's parents dead inside the house. One member of the group was DeFeo's friend Joe Yeswit. He then made the call to the police department. So if you think about it, Chris Watts didn't call the police. It was a friend. It was Nicole Atkinson who called the police. That's already a red flag, right? Then they searched the house, the police, and they found that 6 members of the same family were dead in their beds, right? That is a big idiosyncrasy in this particular case, is that all 6 people are found in their beds, right? In the Chris Watts case, you've got the scenario that supposedly people were killed in their beds, specifically Bella, Cece, and Shanann. Watts' scenario was that, in his first confession, his scenario was that Shanann must have killed Bella in her bed first. Then he found Shanann actively strangling Cece in her bed, and then he killed Shanann. And then I think, according to that scenario, carried her to bed, and then later then removed all 3 of them from the home. I'm just saying, in this scenario, they all killed in their beds, and that's where they found. I don't actually believe that anyone in the Watts case was killed either in their beds or that they died in their beds. I just don't think that is the case. Then it goes on to describe the victim's parents. It was Ronald, who was 43 years old, his wife Louise, who was also 43. He had 4 siblings: Dawn, 18, the eldest; Allison, 13; Mark, 12; and John Matthew. And so of those siblings, DeFeo, also known as Butch, Ronald, aka Butch DeFeo, he was the eldest of all of them. And by some margin, he was 5 years older than the oldest child. And looks like you had sort of separations of 5 years. So 23 for Ronald, 23 years old. Dawn was 18. Allison was 5 years younger than that. Mark was just a year younger than Allison. And then John Matthew, about 3 years younger. So all of the victims had been shot with a .35 caliber lever action Marlin rifle at about 3 o'clock in the morning. And so you can judge from that it's possible that they were all asleep, right? But if they were all asleep, why was Butch awake? Why was DeFeo not only awake? Why did he survive? And I must say, this scenario also reminds me of the crime in New Zealand by David Bain. What's also interesting in this scenario is that the parents had both been shot twice, whereas the children had been killed with single shots. And I think what that shows is some kind of emotional connection or emotional feeling towards the parents that is stronger than to the siblings. So you could say, in a sense, that what was done to the adults in this case was done to some extent out of malice or out of feelings of resentment or ill will, but in terms of the children, it was sort of nothing personal, if that makes sense. This is obviously in terms of criminal psychology. The DeFeo family had occupied that famous house, the house that became the backdrop of the Amityville horror films, 112 Ocean Avenue, since buying it in 1965, right? So the crime happening in 1974 was they'd been living there for 9 years. Something that you've got to also bear in mind is you've got a 23-year-old still living at home and what is going on there. Failure to launch. Why is he still living at home? And his eldest sister, the second eldest child, is kind of probably about to, leave school, perhaps leave home as well. So you sort of want to know what is going on in Ronald's life that would cause so much frustration and emotion. What do you think was going on? In the Chris Watts case, there was a lot of desire. There's a feeling of addiction. What's going on here that would have clouded Ronald's mind, right? So the article in Wikipedia describes the eldest son, known as Butch, is the lone surviving member of the family. He gets taken to a local police station for his protection, and he tells police officers there that he thinks that the killings were carried out by a by a hitman, a guy called Louis Fellini, right? So it's very quick fingering somebody else, and you could imagine that it could be possible, right? You could think, well, we don't know the circumstances here. What is more likely, that a mob hitman would do this, or that it would be the eldest son, which seems to be more likely? But then, just similar to the Chris Watts case, when he was interviewed at the police station, there was suddenly serious inconsistencies in his version of events. I don't know about his emotional effect. I don't know. They don't really talk about that here. But the very next day, he confessed to carrying out the killings himself. So in the same sense as the Watts case, you've got the killer breaking pretty quickly and confessing to doing everything himself. Interestingly, the alleged hitman had an alibi. Fellini happened to be out of state at the time, and so anyway, DeFeo told detectives the following. This is a quote. He said, "Once I started, I just couldn't stop. It went so fast," right? It's something that Chris Watts also said. I just couldn't stop. Once he started strangling Shanann, he just couldn't stop himself. Also, the same thing with, he said something about, if anyone had come in front of me, I just had so much anger, nothing would have stopped me, right? What that is referring to is the same kind of mindset, that there's like a furnace that is raging inside the body of these perpetrators. But what is stoking the fire? And that is what we're going to look at in this particular case. He admitted that he had taken a bath and redressed. So, the other thing that I think you've got to think about right in the beginning is, when he arrives at the bar, is there any blood on his clothing? And it wouldn't really, if there was blood on his clothing, it could mean that he went to his parents' bedside to see if they were okay, and maybe touched them, and perhaps tried to perform CPR or something like that. So in a weird way, it would almost be more of a problem if he didn't have blood on his clothing, and of course he didn't. And so him admitting that he had taken a bath and redressed, and also discarded crucial evidence such as blood-stained clothes and the Marlin rifle and the cartridges before going to work as usual. Right? So if you put this into context, it means that after he returned home from work at 6:30, he went to Henry's bar, right? What that means is the family had been lying dead for something like, it's basically 1,800 hours minus 3 hours, so around about 15 hours they'd been lying dead on their beds. And so he went to work as usual, exactly the same as the Watts case. Now we're going to do the trial and conviction, and then the controversies, which is quite a long section. So his trial began in October 1975. They mounted an affirmative defense of insanity. He said that he killed his family in self-defense because he heard their voices plotting against them. It's a little bit like what Chris Watts said about, a demon. He was possessed by a demon or something like that. It's a little bit like that. And I think there's a little bit of truth in that. I'm not saying that Chris Watts was possessed by a demon, or that this guy's defense of insanity was legally sound. What I am saying is that I think when we deal with what the real drivers were, it's something like being possessed by demons, just being possessed by something that takes hold of a person. And it feels a little bit like, if you want to excuse yourself, you might say, wow, that feeling did feel like I was possessed by something. I wasn't in control of myself. The insanity plea, interestingly, was supported by psychiatrist Daniel Schwartz, and the psychiatrist for the prosecution, Dr. Harold Zolan, said, although DeFeo was a user of heroin and LSD, he had an antisocial personality disorder, and he was aware of his actions at the time of the crime. And there you are getting the bottom line here with DeFeo. Why did he commit this crime? Because he was a druggie. Why did he commit the crime? Because he was an addict. Why did he commit the crime? Or because for whatever reason, probably he was unable to get a job. He had a failure to launch. He was mooching at home, and they probably wanted him to leave home and make a living, and then he took out his entire family, right? And part of that, as you're going to see in a moment, part of the motivation for that was money. He needed money for drugs. If he was going to be kicked out of his home, he was going to need money for the next fix. Where's he going to get money if his parents have kicked him out? So if he kills his parents, maybe he can inherit that money. And you're going to see why there's some substance to that. I just want to compare this, him being addicted to heroin, to Chris Watts being addicted to Nicole Kessinger. And for those people who say that Chris Watts was a psychopath and incapable of love, if you think that, you're not going to feel that sense of being blinded by love, being blinded by desire, that can make you feel addicted to a person. I know I've felt that same sense of almost vertigo and giddiness, where you are so caught up in your feelings for another person, it does feel like you're addicted to them. You feel like when you're not with them, you feel that sense of almost like you can't live without them in a way. It definitely does feel like an addiction. You get a rush whenever you're with them, right? In November 1975, DeFeo was found guilty on all 6 counts. Interestingly, it's of second-degree murder, and that's why he got a relatively low sentence, 25 years to life. And so if you just compare the sentence DeFeo got to the plea agreement that Chris Watts agreed to, just look at how bad Chris Watts' deal ended up being. Chris Watts gets a life sentence, no parole, right? And it's for a smaller body count than DeFeo. DeFeo actually manages to win a little bit of ground in his trial, right? Not a lot, but he certainly gets a bit more out of the whole court process than Chris Watts did. DeFeo was held at the Sullivan Correctional Facility in Fallsburg, New York, and until his death, all of his appeals and requests to the parole board had been denied. This is the part that I really want to draw your attention to, is DeFeo, bear in mind he confessed, and now we're going to look at how he, once he started serving his sentence, how he tried to wriggle out of it. Now bear in mind, it's a drug addict, a former drug addict that is now trying to work the system, trying to get his way so that he can live happily ever after, that he can escape accountability. So in the next section on Wikipedia, it refers to controversies. It refers to all of the 6 victims were found face down in their beds with no sign of a struggle. Bear in mind, Shanann was buried face down. I also get the sense that he strangled Shanann from behind, that he wouldn't need to see her face. With regards to the children, I get the feeling it's possible that they were either sedated at the time, or he put something over their faces that he wouldn't need to see them and they wouldn't see him. But I'm not convinced of that. I think it's also possible that they were unconscious when they breathed their last. It refers to the police investigation finding that the rifle hadn't been fitted with a silencer, and they found evidence of sedatives being administered. Now, to me, that makes sense. It makes sense that the family were sedated, the parents were sedated, the children were sedated, and that is why they slept soundly, or relatively soundly, and that is why he was able to walk with impunity between their beds and bedrooms and shoot them, right? That even when he started shooting, you would think that after the first shot, everyone else would wake up and start running around, but that didn't happen. So unless you had 6 perpetrators all shooting at the same time, this whole scenario was very unlikely, unless they were sedated. Now, this is where it gets interesting. DeFeo admitted during his interrogation that he had drugged his family. Now, I think it makes sense that a drug addict, experiencing himself losing consciousness and being impaired, would think, well, how can I get the better of my family? And so wouldn't he do the same thing? And it would be very easy to drug his family because he would know about their dynamics, their habits. He would have access to the food, to the additives and all that kind of thing, right? Now, this is the part that's really interesting. So he admitted that he drugged his family, but the autopsy report indicated that was a lie per the doctor. So the doctor said, you know what, we did extensive toxicology, not only on the blood and urine, but on all the organs, and it turned up 0, that there wasn't anything in their body. And so you say, well, what is going on here? Was there no sedative used, right? There are other possibilities, of course. You could say that they were all shot somewhere else and that he then put them in their beds. I don't think so. Bear in mind, 15 hours went by before the bodies were, quote-unquote, discovered, right? That's time for something like a sedative, something like a drug to start to break down. I don't know what drug was used here, but it's possible that something like that could have broken down. It is a bit of a problem that nothing comes up in the autopsy, but you have a similar situation in the Watts case where there's the possibility of sedatives being used, but then the autopsy report doesn't show that. Now, does that mean that they weren't used? And there definitely are substances that break down relatively quickly. I don't know whether DeFeo was sophisticated enough to know about certain recreational drugs that can disappear from the system quite quickly. There are certain things you can do. I'm not going to go into it here, but there's certain things you can do. For example, if someone has been taking drugs and you're going to do a job interview, that is going to get rid of it out of your system. And if they're going to do a drug test, it's not going to come up. So there are certain things that do that. I'm not going to go into the science of the various substances used, but there definitely are some substances that can go into the system, compromise the system, and then exit the system, and there's going to be no evidence. It's difficult to know whether DeFeo was that crafty that he would have thought that far. So neighbors said they didn't hear any gunshots, and those who were awake at the time said they just heard the dog barking. And that's also a little bit of a parallel with Dieter. A neighbor also said they heard Dieter barking quite hysterically. I've spoken about that before, but in this case it was a dog called Shaggy that was barking in the middle of the night. And that is also why I think it's quite an important thing, is where did Chris Watts put the dog when all of this was going to happen, because I think he knew if he was going to attack Shanann or the children, the dog could get in the way. And so that was part of his premeditation. It's a part that very few people really think about. And, when Chris Watts returns from the well site, one of the first things he does is he retrieves Dieter from the basement. Well, hadn't he been there all along? DeFeo had a volatile relationship with his father. I think that is speaking volumes. I think possibly the entire murder happened, that the entire mass murder happened because of his poor relationship with his father. I always find it interesting when you have these crimes and then they sort of say, but the motive remains unclear. I just find it crazy that in this world that we live in, we're in the 21st century, and there's such poor intelligence, there's such poor efforts to understand human psychology, that you can have crimes like this that capture the imagination, that they make movies out of, and on a Wikipedia page they will admit, well, we're not quite sure why this happened. I think there's also a parallel to Chris Watts having I wouldn't call it a volatile relationship, but I would call it a testy relationship with his wife. But certainly not absolutely, there's nothing wrong with their relationship. So there were certain people that said, oh, he was the perfect husband, the perfect father, but they were basing that on Shanann's Facebook posts. And only certain people had a sense that things weren't so great between the Watts parents. And some of those were Nathaniel Trinastich, who sometimes heard them arguing, and some of the parents who saw that they weren't sleeping in the same bed or room when they were in North Carolina, and knew about the background, Nutgate, the parents not going to the wedding and all that kind of thing. This doesn't help. So if someone has a motive and they want to do something horrible, not having a good relationship doesn't help. It aggravates those fantasies, those dark fantasies. Do you see what I'm saying? He asked police this is really important. DeFeo asked police what he had to do to collect his father's life insurance, which prompted the prosecution to suggest at trial that his motive was to collect on the life insurance policies of his parents. Now, I don't think it's rocket science to say volatile relationship with his father, the fact that he was 23 years of age, drug addict. It was sort of at a time that he was needing to move out of the family and make a living and stop taking drugs and get going. But he doesn't have money and he's so badly addicted, and so what does he do? He takes the easy way out. Okay, I'll just get rid of my family, then I'll get the money and I can carry on drugging for the rest of my life, kind of thing. So what did he want? He wanted money so that he could continue with his addiction. And isn't that exactly what happened with Chris Watts? He wanted money, not so much, I don't think it was so much about life insurance. I think it was more about he didn't want to keep losing his money, losing his paycheck, losing the house that was in his name. He wanted to regain control of his resources so that he could continue his fairy tale, his addiction with Nicole Kessinger. Does that make sense? The part that's really fascinating is from this point onwards. They say in the article, this is quoting from the Wikipedia article, quote, since his conviction, DeFeo has given several varying accounts of how the killings were carried out, end quote. Now, that is just a perfect parallel to Chris Watts making a second confession, a third confession. I don't really know where we are at this point, but there certainly have been varying accounts as well. Then going back to Wikipedia, quote, in a 1986 interview for Newsday, DeFeo claimed his sister Dawn killed their father and then their distraught mother killed all of his siblings, apparently with a .38. So this is, again, a parallel scenario where his sister kills their father, not him, and then their distraught mother, parallel to Shanann killing everybody, then did everything. And then, so then you say, well, what did he do? What's going on here? Then he says, well, he then killed his mother. So what he wants to do here is minimize his involvement. So what he's saying here is that, his family members did everything, and then he did something. And so he's trying to admit some role, but he's trying to minimize his sentences. Exactly what Chris Watts is doing. He says in the article here, he says he took the blame because he was afraid to say anything negative about his mother to their father, and that his father's uncle is afraid that his father's uncle would kill him. So you kind of have almost a similar situation, that it's almost like, why wouldn't you say anything? Well, because of, the mobster. If the mobster killed my family, I was scared to do anything or whatever. Well, now the mobster has become the father's uncle, kind of thing. And so what is interesting is his father's uncle was Pete DeFeo, who was part of the Genovese crime family. So that is obviously where the idea came about. I don't know if I'm going to go too much further through all his other versions, where he talks about he was married at the time to someone called Geraldine. He drove to Amityville with Geraldine's brother, and then he becomes implicated. In 1990, he filed a 440 motion to have his conviction vacated. I'll put a link in the description. You can read about all the intrigue, all the various things that he tries to do. As recently as 2000, well, I guess it's not that recently, as 21 years ago, he met with a guy called Rick Osuna, the author of The Night the DeFeos Died. That was published ultimately in 2002. According to the author, they spoke for about 6 hours. So yeah, you've got a similar thing with the author Sherilyn Cadle. And then in a letter to a radio show host Lou Gentile, DeFeo denied giving Osuna the information that he gave him. He said they just really they didn't speak about anything related to the events. And so he distanced himself from that conversation with Rick Osuna. So he had the same controversy about what was said in the book, kind of thing. Now, according to the author, DeFeo said that he committed the murders with his sister Dawn. So here you have a situation where the author befriends him, and then DeFeo makes up a story that is going to kind of help his case. It's not true. In other words, he lies to this author. He says they committed the crimes out of desperation because his parents had plotted to kill him. Now, I don't want to really conflate that with Shanann. I don't think Shanann was going to, harm Watts. But if they had gotten a divorce, Watts stood to lose a lot. She may have plotted to ruin his reputation on social media, and he may have suffered something of a social death. Who knows? He may have even have lost his job if Shanann had told Anadarko that he was having an affair with a co-worker or whatever, and maybe Watts felt that was a risk to him, kind of thing. DeFeo also apparently claimed that, this is to the author, that he had a big row with his father, almost like the conversation he'd had with Shanann, Chris Watts with Shanann. And then then he goes on to blame his sister for doing everything, and they killed the children to eliminate them as witnesses, which is something that also came up in the Watts case. Something that was interesting, I guess, which is similar to the blood alcohol content argument or whatever, there was a little bit of difficulty where there was some unburned gunpowder on Dawn's nightgown, and because of that, because of his knowledge of that, he was then able to say, well, because it's unburned, means that she was holding the weapon, right? But it was really just the fact that she was very close. She was in close proximity to it, and that is why this gunpowder was found on her nightgown. The medical examiner, just same as in the Watts case with Shanann, they found no signs of a struggle with Dawn or any of the other victims. Something that is interesting, that certainly makes the whole thing start to shift, the reality of the case start to shift, is physical evidence showed that Louise, so Butcher's mother, and her daughter Alison were possibly awake at the time of their deaths. They don't really say why that is. I'm not quite sure what that physical evidence was that suggested that, but that is what they say here. That physical evidence could be something like the clothing that they were wearing, or possibly their stomach contents, what was in their food, or something like that, what they'd eaten or when they'd had their last meal. And what I've tried to do here in this episode is just show you how you have intertextual elements in broadly similar crimes. So there's certain things that are definitely different. So, the murder weapon used, the age of the perpetrator. This guy was the eldest son. He wasn't a husband or a father. But then you have other similarities, such as which are broad similarities, but they're nevertheless similarities, such as the addiction, and then also the attempts to wriggle out of it by making up these minimizing stories and coming up with all these different versions, hoping that something's going to stick as he becomes more and more desperate to escape his prison sentence. So I hope you found this analysis interesting. For those who are following the John Benet Ramsey case, I've just put up a really interesting chapter on the chummy legal system in Boulder. I've also put a link to an excellent New York Times article describing that chummy legal culture. That's on Twitter. You can go to my handle on Twitter @CrimeRocket and read that article. It's just a very, very good article on that. And then I'll likely be covering more on the Sarah Everard case. There are some patrons, some people that are followers or fans or readers of True Crime Rocket Science that actually live in the area where the killer is sandwiched, and they've been sharing some of their thoughts, fears, and sentiments. And I've asked them to send in some photos of what they're seeing around them in terms of the ongoing police investigation. One of the questions is, where did Cousins take Sarah after he abducted her? Did he take her home? If so, I think that would to some extent implicate his wife, if he felt comfortable just taking her home. Or did he take her into the tunnels and the sort of labyrinths around near to where he was staying? And that seems to be why the investigators are combing the town of Sandwich as we speak. So I'll be talking about that in the next video on Sarah Everard. If you're not sure about that case, check it out. I've already put up 2 videos on the case. It's gathering a lot of momentum in the UK. Sarah Everard has come to symbolize silenced women everywhere. If you haven't subscribed yet to the channel, please do like, share, leave a comment. You can also join the True Crime Rocket Science community on Patreon at patreon.com/TCRS. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.